The Indianapolis Community Hall buzzed with a quiet, reverent hum that crisp October evening in 2025, the air tinged with the faint scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting through the cracked windows. Rows of wooden pews borrowed from a nearby church groaned softly under a crowd of locals. Farmers in flannel shirts, their hands rough from harvest. Retirees clutching programs with trembling fingers. Families balancing hymnals and coffee cups, the steam curling upward in the dim light. They'd gathered under the glow of flickering chandeliers to hear Mike Pence, the former vice president, whose starched suit and measured Midwestern drawl filled the space with an aura of solemnity. The hall, typically a backdrop for 4-H meetings and bake sales, felt transformed tonight, almost like a sanctuary, as his voice rolled over the murmurs family, faith, the heart of America, his hands clasped in front of him like a preacher at the pulpit. The crowd clapped gently, their applause a polite echo, some nodding with quiet reverence, others shifting with a curiosity tinged with fatigue, the energy softer than the roaring crusades of his political peak. Outside, the wind rustled through bare trees, a low moan that seemed to whisper secrets against the stained glass panes. But inside, in the third row, a small figure sat poised, a spark of defiance glowing beneath a cascade of chestnut curls. Her presence a subtle tremor against the room's steady calm. 9-year-old Sophia sat with her knees tucked under her dark curls spilling over a navy sweater, a battered blue satchel slung across her chest like a soldier's pack. Her boots tapped faintly against the pew, scuffed from climbing trees and racing through the fields near her family's modest farmhouse. Her sweater sleeves rolled up to reveal wrists smudged with pencil lead. Beside her, her grandfather, a stooped man with a white beard and a worn Bible in his lap, kept his eyes on Pence, his gnarled hands resting on the leather cover, his lips moving silently as if in prayer. Inside Sophia's satchel wasn't a snack or a toy, but a spiral notebook, its pages crinkled and stained with ink questions she'd scribbled in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, born from a doubt that gnawed at her soul. "You don't need to say it, Soph," he'd murmured as they'd left their creaking porch that evening, his voice gravelly with age and concern. "He's a man of God." But Sophia's brown eyes had flashed, her grip tightening on the strap until her knuckles paled. "I need to know," she'd said, and he'd seen a fire in her he couldn't quench, a fire stoked by months of wrestling with a truth she couldn't reconcile. For months ago, Sophia's world had shifted. Her best friend, Ellie 10, with a laugh like wind chimes, had vanished from her Sunday school class, her pew empty one crisp morning after a whispered rumor spread through the congregation. Cancer, too fast, too late. Sophia had sat with her in the hospital, sneaking cookies past the nurses, holding her hand as Ellie's breaths grew shallow. Her "see you soon, Soph," a promise that broke when the machines went silent. The funeral was small wildflowers on a plain casket, Ellie's mom's sobs echoing in the church, but the questions lingered, clawing at Sophia's faith. She'd grown up on her grandpa's Bible stories, Noah, the VYD, Jesus healing the sick, tales of a God who loved, who saved. But Ellie's empty chair, the tear-streaked faces at the Sayre VYC, the preacher's God's plan that rang hollow in her ears, they didn't fit. She'd started writing in that notebook, at first just sketches, crosses, doves, then words, halting and fierce, until they shaped the question she carried now, a burden she needed to lay at someone's feet. Pence moved through his speech with the cadence of a sermon, traditional values, the sanctity of life, a nation under God, his voice steady and warm, drawing murmurs of amen and soft claps from the faithful. He spoke of prayer in schools, of strengthening communities, his hands gesturing with the calm assurance of a man who'd spent decades marrying politics to piety. Sophia watched, her stillness a sharp contrast to the restless kids around her, some doodling on programs, others tugging at their parents' coats. Her fingers traced the satchel's frayed strap, her eyes following Pence's every move, the way his glasses caught the light, the way his smile stayed fixed, a mask of certainty she couldn't trust. The crowd leaned in, some with reverence, others with a quiet weariness, their faces a gallery of hope and doubt under the chandelier's glow. A farmer in the back adjusted his cap, muttering about crop prices. A grandmother beside him clutched a rosary, her lips mo-vy-ing in silent agreement with Pence's words. But Sophia sat like a sentinel, her breath tight, her heart pounding as she waited for the moment she'd rehearsed in her mind 100 times. The moderator, a wiry man with a clipboard and a nervous smile, called for questions, and the room stirred. Hands rose, slowly, a mechanic asking about jobs, his voice rough with diesel. A teacher querying education funds, her tone clipped. A retiree wondering about Social Security, his glasses fogging as he spoke. Pence answered each with a practiced ease, his responses laced with scripture and smiles, quotes from Proverbs, nods to hard-working Hoosiers, a promise to keep faith first. The crowd clapped politely, some nodding, others exchanging glances that hinted at questions unasked, the answers soothing but not stirring, like a hymn sung off-key. Sophia's grandfather glanced at her, his Bible creaking as he shifted, worry etching his weathered brow. "You sure, Soph?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble. But she shook her head, her curls bouncing, and slid off the pew with a soft thud that rippled through the quiet. She moved forward, her boots scuffing the polished floor, her steps deliberate as she wove through the maze of knees and coats to the microphone stand. The crowd barely noticed at first, their focus still on Pence's latest answer, something about moral foundations, but then heads turned, eyes narrowing as this small figure emerged from the shadows. Whispers buzzed, "Who's that girl? What's in that bag? She's awful young." Their voices a low hum that grew as she reached the front. She stood there, dwarfed by the microphone, her blue satchel a shield against the tide of stares washing over her. The moderator faltered, his clipboard trembling, his mouth opening to redirect, but Sophia raised a hand, her small fingers steady, claiming her turn with a quiet defiance that hushed the room. The murmurs faded, a brittle silence settling like frost on the fields, every creak and sigh swallowed by the stillness. Pence paused, his head tilting slightly, his warm gaze softening with a paternal curiosity as he rested his hands on the podium. "Well, hello there, young lady," he said, his drawl gentle and inviting, a smile tugging at his lips. "What's on your mind tonight?" Sophia unslung her satchel, her hand steady despite the tremble in her chest, and pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page smudged with ink and tears. She took a deep breath, her sweater rising with the effort, and looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce and unyielding. "Mr. Pence," she began, her voice low but a thunderbolt, "you say God's good, so why do you let my friend die when we prayed so hard?" The words struck like a bell in a storm, clear and shattering, splitting the calm with a raw, unfiltered truth. Pence's smile vanished, his eyes widening, his hands tightening on the podium as the crowd gasped a sharp, collective inhale that sucked the air dry. His face, a bastion of faith and certainty, faltered, Chakar vying lines across his brow, doubt flickering in his gaze, a vulnerability he couldn't mask in that moment. A 9-year-old had shaken him to his core. The silence that followed was electric, a live wire humming through the Indianapolis hall, Sophia's question reverberating like a hymn turned upside down. It wasn't just a child's curiosity, it was a crack in the foundation of everything Pence had built, a plea wrapped in pain that demanded more than platitudes. The chandeliers flickered faintly, casting jagged shadows that danced across the pews, as if the light itself trembled under the weight of her words. Pence stood rooted, his knuckles whitening against the podium, his starched composure unraveling under a scrutiny he'd never faced in Senate chambers or prayer circles. His eyes darted to the crowd, searching for refuge, stalling for grace, then locked back on Sophia, who stood unwavering, her notebook clutched like a sacred text, its ink-stained pages a silent testament to a faith tested and found wanting. The room's warmth dissolved, every rustle of a coat, every shift of a boot, every stifled breath swallowed by a hush that pulsed with her hurt. This wasn't a reporter's jab or a skeptic's taunt, it was a little girl's doubt. Its purity a mirror held up to a man who'd made faith his shield, and it reflected something he couldn't ignore. Sophia didn't flinch. Her boots stayed planted, her brown eyes piercing, daring him to answer not with sermons, but with something real. Her grandfather sank lower in his pew, his Bible slipping to his knee, his white beard trembling as he bowed his head, caught between pride and fear for the storm his granddaughter had unleashed. Whispers flared, "She's just a kid." How's he going to handle that? That's deep. Their voices a low, urgent buzz that swelled and then hushed as the moderator waved them down, his clipboard shaking like a flag in a gale. Pence cleared his throat, a rough, halting sound that broke the silence, and adjusted his tie with a quick Tugger reflex, a lifeline he grasped as the room waited. "That's a mighty question," he said finally, his drawl quieter now, stripped of its pulpit polish, the warmth fraying into something fragile. The crowd leaned forward, their bodies a sea of tilted heads and wide eyes, sensing a fracture in the man who'd stood as a pillar of piety for decades, a crack that widened with every heartbeat he didn't fill. He took a deep breath, his chest rising under his crisp white shirt, and met Sophia's unflinching gaze with eyes that shimmered, just for a moment, with something unguarded doubt, perhaps, or a grief he'd buried deep. "I grew up in Columbus," he began, his voice softening into something raw, almost confessional. "A small town in Indiana, where the church bells rang every Sunday and the field stretched out like a promise. My folks took us to Sare V.Y. Sesam, and my brothers sitting in pews, just like these, singing hymns, learning about a God who loved us, who had a plan. I held on to that, carried it through life, through Washington, through everything." His words trailed off, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't the statesman who'd prayed on national stages, just a man peering into a faith that suddenly felt too small for the question before him. The crowd held its breath, the farmer in the back pausing mid-adjustment, the grandmother's rosary stilling in her hands. Every eye locked on Pence as he stood suspended in his own story. Sophia tilted her head, her curls swaying gently, her silence a quiet demand that pressed him deeper into the moment. "I've got 4 grandkids," Pence continued, his voice steadying but laced with a tremor he couldn't hide. "Them I lie trunning around the yard, asking questions about heaven, about Jesus." But years ago, he faltered, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the podium until the wood creaked under his grip. "My sister, Mary, she was 32, a mom, a believer. Cancer took her slow, then fast. We prayed, Lord. Did we pray kneeling by our bed, begging for a miracle? I'd sit there, reading Psalms, telling her God was near. She'd smile, say, 'He's got me, Mike,' but then she was gone. I stood at her grave, asking why her? Why not an answer? I told myself it was his will, leaned on Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, but it didn't feel good. It still doesn't." His voice broke, a sharp, brittle crack that echoed through the hall, and he looked down, blinking hard against the tears that welled in his eyes, his glasses fogging as he fought to steady himself. The crowd gasped, a jagged, collective wave of shock and empathy that rolled through the pews like a gust through the fields. A teacher in the front row pressed a hand to her chest, her sob muffled but piercing. A farmer in a flannel shirt bowed his head, muttering in, under his breath, his cap dipping low. A young mother in the back clutched her toddler tighter, her eyes glistening as she nodded slowly. Sophia's grandfather looked up from his Bible, his white beard trembling, a tear streaking down his weathered cheek to drip onto the leather cover, Leah VYing a dark spot that spread like a stain. Pence's words weren't just an answer, they were a confession, a crack in the bedrock of a faith he'd wielded like armor, and they landed with a weight that shook the room to its core. Pence pressed on, his voice firming but hollowed out, as if the confession had drained something vital from him. "We've got to trust God's plan," he said, his drawl reaching for its old certainty. "Even when it's hard, even when we don't see the why. I've fought for that prayer in schools. Laws to honor faith, them not stopping." The words rang thin, a preacher's echo that felt rehearsed. drowned by the vulnerability he'd let bleed through moments before. Sophia's brow furrowed, her hands tightening on her notebook until the pages crinkled, her lips pressing into a line that said she wasn't here for verses she wanted truth, something to hold when the prayers went unanswered. The crowd sensed it too, their murmurs shifting from awe to unease, a restless energy bubbling beneath the surface as they waited for more. The moderator edged closer, his clipboard clutched like a shield, his nervous smile twitching as he prepared to move the night along. But Pence raised a hand, a quick, sharp gesture that stopped him cold, his polished shoes scuffing the floor as he stepped from the podium, abandoning its safety entirely. He crouched before Sophia, his suit jacket brushing the wood, his sharp edges blurring into something tender, almost broken. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice a whisper now, barely audible over the wind outside, but carrying a weight that filled the silence. "Sophia," she said, her tone steady, fierce, a quiet strength blooming beneath the tremor of her breath. Pence nodded, a faint smile breaking through the cracks in his composure, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You're brave, Sophia, braver than I was at your age, braver than most." Soft claps rippled through the crowd, tentative at first, then fading as the air thickened again, heavy with expectation. Sophia shifted her weight, her boots scuffing the floor, and looked up at Pence with a clarity that cut through the haze. "Grandpa says God's love saves us," she said, her voice a clear, ringing chime that sliced through the quiet like a bell over the plains. "But if he didn't save Ellie, does he really love us?" Pence rocked back on his heels, his face crumpling for a heartbeat, a flash of a man unmoored. Not a preacher, his certainty dissolving into something raw and human. The crowd caught its breath, a teacher's sob breaking free, a farmer's cap dipping as he bowed his head, the weight of Sophia's words pressing down on every soul in the hall. Pence stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his hands flexing at his sides as he turned to face the audience, his gaze sweeping over them with a heavy-ness that hadn't been there before, a shadow of doubt and resolve mingling in his eyes. "She's right to ask," he said, his voice louder now, broken but rising, cutting through the murmurs like a prayer turned plea. "I've spent my life saying God's love is sure. His plan is perfect, but if kids like Sophia are questioning it, if they're losing friends and finding empty pews, then maybe I've missed something. Maybe we all have." The room erupted, gasps sharp as shattered ice, sobs spilling from throats too tight to hold them, a swell of disbelief that crashed over the pews like a flood across the fields. A young mother leapt to her feet, her hands clasped as tears streamed down her face. A retiree pounded his hymnal against the pew, his Lord, yes, a growl that rumbled through the chaos. A farmer's wife clutched a rosary, her whispered truth lost in the din but etched in her glistening eyes. Sophia's question had become a mirror, reflecting a doubt too deep to dismiss, a truth too raw to bury, and Pence's admission had lit a match that set the room ablaze. The Indianapolis hall trembled now, a wildfire roaring from Sophia's spark, fanned by Pence's unraveling into a blaze that consumed every corner of the space. He stood exposed, his suit wrinkled, his hands flexing as if grasping for a faith he'd lost in the storm of his own making. Sophia held her ground, her navy sweater a flare of quiet strength against the dimness, her notebook a banner of a doubt that had flipped the night into chaos and reshaped it into something sacred. The crowd was no longer a congregation, tears-streaked, wind-worn faces, tracing paths through the dust of harvest days. Hands clasped in tight, desperate grips, knuckles whitening. Eyes blazed with shock, sorrow, and a dawning resolve that flickered like stars breaking through a storm. Her question, "Does he really love us?" had torn the room apart, peeling back layers of certainty to reveal a bleeding heart beneath, and Pence's "maybe I've missed something" had struck the flint, igniting a fire that refused to be contained. Pence wiped his brow with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing his glasses as he stepped back to the podium. But its wooden shield was ash now, a relic of a certainty he couldn't reclaim. God's plan is bigger than us. He'd preached in churches and conventions, his voice ringing with con vy tying across airwaves and altars, a line that once drew hallelujahs and raised hands. Now it haunted him, a hollow echo carved into the lines of his face-tight lips pressed into a thin slash, shadowed eyes glistening with a doubt he couldn't bury, a sorrow that clung to him like the chill outside. The crowd felt it too, their murmurs swelling into a tempest soft at first, a ripple of "she's right," and "how do we answer that?" Then louder, a chorus of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of grief and awakening. A farmer stood, his flannel shirt taut across his shoulders, his gravelly, "I lost my boy too," cutting through the noise like a plow through soil. A teacher beside him rose, her sob breaking as she nodded, her "my niece" a whisper that carried. A young father in the back rocked his toddler, his muttered "we've got to face this" a plea that hung in the air. Sophia's grandfather staggered to his feet, pulling her close, his Bible tumbling to the pew as he pressed his lips to her curls, his stooped frame trembling with a mix of pride and heartbreak. "You're my warrior, Soph," he choked out, his voice breaking as tears fell free, dripping on her sweater to leave dark, blooming spots on the navy wool. Sophia nodded, her small hand patting his arm with a tenderness beyond her years, but her brown eyes stayed locked on Pence, glistening with a quiet steel that refused to bend. Pence crouched again, his knees brushing the floor, and reached out with a hand that shook despite his effort to steady it. Sophia hesitated, then took itiny fingers curling into his trembling palm, a bond forged in the wreckage of a night neither had foreseen. "You're a light, Sophia," Pence said, his voice thick with awe, cracking under the weight of the moment. "Don't ever dim it. You hear?" Sophia smiled, soft but real, a faint curve of her lips that lit her face like dawn over the plains. "Ellie wouldn't," she whispered, her words a dagger and a lifeline. And Pence froze, the ghost of his sister Mary echoing in the girl's unwavering resolve. He stood slowly, his shoes scuffing as he rose, and turned to the crowd, his voice rising now, raw and unshackled, cutting through the chaos like a beacon through the dark. "This isn't just my wrestle," he said, fierce and trembling, his hands slashing the air as if to carve the words into the pews. "It's ours, all of ours. Kids like Sophia question God while we sing hymns and build walls, while we lean on verses that don't heal the holes they're left with. She's not afraid to ask, so why are we? Why are we hiding from the doubts that could draw us closer to him, closer to each other?" The room exploded applause, thundered like a breaking dam. Shouts tore from throats raw with emotion. Pews creaked as people leapt to their feet in a swell that shook the floor. A teacher stood, sobbing openly, clapping until her hands bruised red. A farmer pounded his fist, his in a growl that rumbled through the chaos. A young mother lifted her toddler high, her "yes, yes," a chant that wove into the roar. Strangers embraced, their arms locking in a desperate, unspoken pact, farmers with retirees, parents with teachers' voices clashing in a cacophony of "we've got to face it, this is on us, no more silence." And Sophia stood with her grandpa, a fragile spark, now a blazing torch lighting the night. Pence raised both hands, palms out, stilling the tempest with a gesture that trembled but held firm, his face a battlefield of ruin and fire, cheeks streaked with the tears he'd stopped fighting, eyes alight with a purpose that burned through the haze. "Tomorrow, I'm not just praying," he said, his voice steady now, but shaking with a resolve that rattled the hall. "Not just preaching, I'm sitting with kids like Sophia, with families like yours, farmers, teachers, believers, all of you, and we're going to wrestle this together. Faith isn't a shield to hide behind, it's a fire we carry, a question we answer with action. I'll be darned if I don't face it with you." The crowd roared again, a tidal wave of sound that lifted the roof claps sharp as thunder, cheers ragged with hope, tears streaming down, faces lifted in defiance and unity, and Sophia's grandfather lifted her arm high, her navy sweater soaring like a flag as she waved her notebook like a torch blazing against the dark. People stood as one, linked by a shared wound that bled through faith and doubt, a fragile hope flickering into something fierce, their applause a vow to rise, to question, to heal. As Pence stepped back from the podium, his shoulders slumped but his eyes burning with a faith rekindled, the room pulsed with a truth that refused to fade. A child had shaken a giant, not with scorn or rebellion, but with a question too pure, too true to dodge. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, his voice nearly lost in the deafening din, a whisper that carried over the storm. "For making me look again, for making us all look." Sophia nodded, her curls bouncing as she leaned into her grandfather's embrace, and whispered into his ear, "Ellie'd be proud, right?" He hugged her tighter, tears streaming down his cheeks to soak into her sweater, his voice a broken sob of love. "So proud, soft, so proud," she'd sing. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the hall, but the fire didn't dim. People lingered in the pews, their voices low and urgent, plotting, dreaming, changed. Hands clasped, plans whispered, prayers shared. Meetings set strangers no longer strangers, but a community forged in the heat of a little girl's courage. The energy lingered, a current that crackled through the hall even as the pews emptied, the crowd spilling out into the crisp night where the wind howled and the stars blazed through a thinning veil of clouds. Sophia's voice, small but mighty, echoed beyond the weathered walls of the community hall, a call that stretched across the city, the state, the nation, watching through screens and streams. If a 9-year-old could question faith and demand more, could lay bare a doubt and light a fire, then so could we, so must we. And Mike Pence's face cracked open by a child's truth, then rebuilt with a faith that burned brighter than his steadfast past, told the story louder than any sermon ever could. Some questions begin with the smallest hearts, the ones that refuse to be quiet, and they're the ones that might just lead us home.